Thunderbolt 3 on Threadripper 2. Hello everyone, welcome to Builder Buy. I'm your host Gil Boyd. Thanks for joining us. And we want to show you something that we find truly amazing. Yes, we have Thunderbolt 3 working on the Threadripper 2. Now we're using the Gigabyte X399 Aorus Xtreme motherboard, and we're going to be using the Gigabyte Titan Ridge Thunderbolt 3 card, and that's the latest of the cards that Gigabyte has out. I want to take you to a link on Gigabyte's site that will show you the technology, because Gigabyte has had 4 different cards. Now, ASUS had a card, MSI had a card, ASRock has had a card. But the latest card with the latest Intel chipset is this card. So I want to show you that link. Now, we will also post a link to this URL that right now is gigabyte.com/motherboard/Thunderbolt-card. So you can see all 4 of the Thunderbolt cards that have been made available by Gigabyte. And what we may even do is go to Amazon, so I'll show you, because the Titan Ridge and the Alpine Ridge version 2 are listed for sale, but the one you want to get is the Titan Ridge. So when we go to the Titan Ridge, we'll click on that, and this uses the Intel DSL7540 Thunderbolt 3 controller. And I think that is why we are having success to the degree that we do. Now if we go to support, we've got downloads. You can see the operating system. It only supports Windows 10 64-bit. There's also another link for the manual. You can download the manual. I've already done that, and it's important to read through this manual and understand it. First of all, the chipset, the specifications, the back panel connectors, of which there are 1 display port in, 2 mini display port in, but for what we're going to do for our purpose, 2 Thunderbolt 3 ports out, Thunderbolt port 1 and Thunderbolt port 2. The internal connectors, there are 2 6-pin power connectors, and this brings up an interesting point. When you're building your system and you're getting a power supply to go in it, 750 watts will probably do the job. You want to make sure you have enough connections for these extra devices. So instead of getting a power supply that supports 1 video card, you want to make sure your power supply can support at least 2 video cards. So 2 connections can go to your video card if you need it, and 2 other connections can go to this card if you need it. 2 6-pin PCI Express power connectors, 1 USB 2 header, which will go to the motherboard, and then the 1 5-pin header, which is the THB_C header, and that cable is included. Now what I'm going to do is a rundown of what this card looks like. We've already got it installed in the machine. We've got 4 internal connectors from the top going down, 2 for power, 1 for USB, and the other is the Thunderbolt header. And the Thunderbolt header on the motherboard is just in back. If you see the light spot where that cable comes out, this cable right here, just in back of the video card. And if you notice, we have the card in the lowest slot in the case. So we have 2 16-lane slots and 2 8-lane slots. And this card is a 4 PCI lane card. And we did not have to bifurcate the slot. I thought we might, but we didn't. And on the outside, on the back, we'll take a look at the connectors. If you notice right here, we've got 1 input for display port, full display port, and over here 2 inputs for mini display port, and these are our Thunderbolt ports, 1 and 2. Card's pretty easy to install, no big deal about that. We wanted to plug it in and see what was involved, and it comes with 2 cables, one the USB connector for signaling. And as far as resource allocation, once you use that connector on the motherboard, you may be scrambling for some more USB 2 ports coming out the front of the case. So we have 1 USB 2 port coming to the case, and the other USB 2 port going to this card, and then of course the Thunderbolt cable. And that's the number 1 requirement. Number 1, the motherboard has to have a Thunderbolt header. Number 2, you're going to need at least a 4-lane slot. This is PCI Express 3.0. And I'll get into the other requirements here in a couple of minutes. Now the power tap, this brings up an interesting issue. This is 2 6-pin power taps. So what you'll want to do when you get a power supply, probably at least a 750 watt or bigger, a power supply that can accommodate probably 2 video cards, because we have 2 power taps on the video card, and those are straight through. And then we used 1 cable that was a Y cable to give power to this card, and that's in case you decide to do everything with it. Now everything meaning if you want to pull power out to some device, the device we're going to use has its own power supply, and I'm not going to be hooking up the video cables. We're just trying to get the bare bones going right now. And remember this interface, this is a PCI Express 3.0 card, and it's a PCI Express 4-lane card and support Windows 10 64-bit only. Now when we download the driver, there's a document within the driver that's extremely interesting, and from that one document it'll help you to go looking for other terminology, other information that you might not find otherwise. I'm going to show you. When you download the driver, you'll download a zip file, and this is the file currently right now with the current driver. When you unzip that file and look in that folder for Thunderbolt, there's a license document that's from Intel. That you don't need to concern yourself with. But what you want to do is the release notes. Now I've made a copy of that so I can bring it up and take a look at it. These release notes are very, very interesting. Not only does it tell the current version of the software driver, it also tells what chipsets are supported, and it also has some information that I would suggest to read through to understand how the driver works. But at the very end of the document, there's some information about Thunderbolt, such as limitations. The Thunderbolt networking implementation does not support link aggregation, also known as teaming or bonding, via the operating system. So if you look at the driver, it also talks about connecting devices, and I would strongly encourage you to read through this to better understand what's going on. Now, our expectation when we installed this was that we were going to have to go into the BIOS and make some changes. I expected 2 changes because I expected to see something in the BIOS under peripherals, where there would be a heading for Thunderbolt that you would then turn it on and tell it what slot it's in. That setting's not there. I thought there might be a second thing we would have to do, which would be under chipset, where you go into chipset and bifurcate the slot, which means take it from a by 8 slot to a 4x4. Didn't have to do that, but I thought it might be necessary. My expectation when we get a BIOS update, which we need, and I'll show you why, once we get that BIOS update for that integration, then I would expect that feature to be in the BIOS that you would then turn on. We'll see, but I'm going to show you some more. Now when we first installed the card, my expectation was the card is installed, the driver's installed, was when we went to Device Manager that we would see a setting or a heading for Thunderbolt 3. There's not one specifically for Thunderbolt 3. I wonder if that will change later, because if we had a 1394 card in here, it would show up under its own heading, just like the USB does. But where it's at right now is under System Devices. So if I go to System Devices and go to the bottom of this list, we're going to find that Thunderbolt 3 controller. Not only did we find the Thunderbolt 3 controller, but I'm going to show you some screen captures for a couple of, I'll say, anomalies that I was not expecting. And once I've shown you these anomalies, I'll tell you how we fixed it. When we first installed the card, we had this notice come up that said base system device, which I thought was pretty odd stuff. So at that point, then we installed the driver. Once we had the software installed, that changed and everything looked normal until we looked under System Devices. Then under System Devices, we had the Thunderbolt controller, but we also had an error. Once we got the driver installed, then we had a PCI Express upstream switch port error. And when I clicked on that, it said code 31. Now, if you go looking at code 31 to try to figure what that is, the information you're going to find specifically from Microsoft is not going to get you where you need to be. So if you find that page about code 31 and it talks about doing something in the registry, you've gone down a rabbit hole. Don't do that. What's going on is your chipset drivers may not be current. So your BIOS needs to be current. The firmware in this card needs to be current, which it is. You need to have the latest video drivers installed, but you also need to have the latest chipset. Now the chipset drivers we used when we built the machine, there was a new version out. When we installed the new version, this little problem with a PCI Express upstream switch port went away. Now it came back when we plugged in a Thunderbolt 2 device. After a reboot, it went away, but we still couldn't see everything. So if you see that PCI Express upstream switch port, there's nothing you need to do in the registry. What you need is to make sure your chipset driver is the latest version. Now, we didn't go to Gigabyte to get the latest version of that. For our chipset driver, we went straight to AMD and downloaded the latest chipset driver. So when you're doing that, there's some Threadripper software for the Threadripper, for the Ryzen, and for the Ryzen Threadripper that you'll want to download. Number one, your chipset drivers. Once we got the driver installed, and once we got our chipset driver installed and rebooted and got rid of the PCI Express upstream switch port error, then it was time to do something else. The next step was to take a look at the software. We've got one document we can read that came with the driver. We've looked at the device manager, but the next thing to look at, and if you look on the menu for the Thunderbolt software, all you'll see is that Thunderbolt application. This document that's the README file is with the driver when you uncompress it. Now down here on the bottom right corner on the system tray, if you notice, we've got the icon for the Thunderbolt software. I'm going to right click on that, and everything here matters. We want to look at View Attached Devices, and the first time you attach a device, you'll get a menu that pops up that says, do you want to approve this all the time, one time, or not at all? Then you've got Approved Attached Devices, which is grayed out, Thunderbolt Networking, Manage Approved Devices, Settings, and About. And it's important to go through all this to make sure this is working before we plug anything in, so we're not scratching our head going, what's going on? Because once we plug this in, we're going to see some other settings. I'll come back to this in just a second. Let's go back to the system tray. And if you notice, the hot swap icon for plug and unplug of USB devices is not present. Once we plug in a device, it will be, and there will be a phantom menu that will pop up. We're going to come back to it when we plug into a device. But right now, if we want to view attached devices, manage, settings, or about, we'll go to the About screen. And this is extremely important. This shows us the software version, the application version, the service version, and the controller driver version. Network driver version unknown because we have not plugged in to activate that. Sometimes this menu doesn't give all this information unless a device is plugged in. It did the first time I've looked at it, and it's still there because we have had something plugged into it. So this shows us the Thunderbolt controller, the generation Thunderbolt 3, 15EB, number of ports 2, and the security level user authorization SL1. Three terms you're going to want to be familiar with are the SL levels, user authorization, the NVM firmware version. You're going to also hear about PD, which is power delivery, and the NVM, which is the non-volatile memory. This is version 23, and that's important to note as we're looking at some of the other software. All this information is current, all this information is new, and I hope it's going to be helpful to you when you're getting this installed. Plug the card in, install the driver, make sure your BIOS is current, make sure your chipset's driver is current, make sure your video driver is current. All those things matter. And some of the best information I have found has not been from Intel and not been from Gigabyte, but from the vendors that sell devices. And I'll show you what I mean in a few minutes when we plug in this media dock. Now this is the media dock we're going to plug into. What I like about this is the Atech BlackJet Cinema dock. It has SSD 1, SSD 2. These are fixed. Then it has these other two modules that can be swapped out. This first module is for CFast 2.0 and QXD. That can be changed out. And the second one is for compact flash, SDXC, and micro SD. That too is a module that can be removed. There's one screw in back to take the lid off. Then there's two screws that hold this module on. You just slide it out and slide a new one in. So in other words, if we wanted to have two modules that do SD, we could take this out, purchase another module, and have the same on both sides. But this gives us maximum compatibility. And there's also another module they're working on if you've got some other video gear. I'll show you the link that goes to that, and we'll also have it listed in the video. But this is the media dock we're going to use. And on the back side of this, it's got two Thunderbolt ports, and it also has its own power tap, and it has a wall wart. It looks like a pretty simple device. This is rack mountable, but this is something that we're going to use to do Thunderbolt 3 with. We need some way to be able to take our SD cards and quickly go through the process of putting them in here and getting them up onto another computer. Now we're going to plug in the media dock and show you what we're talking about. First thing we've got to do is plug in power. There'll be a light up here on the side. Now if we were using the cable that came with it, this cable is kind of short. For a rack mount device, it's perfect. But for our purpose, since this is sitting on top of the case, it doesn't reach down quite far enough. It needs to be like about 2 inches longer. So we're using a different cable. This is by Belkin. Also a passive cable, and it's about twice as long. If you get too long, you lose your Thunderbolt 3 40 gigabit. You'll drop it down to like 10 gigabit. Then you have to go to an active cable. This is a passive cable. We may drop down in speed, but all we're trying to do is connectivity. So this is the cable we're going to use. This will get us from the device in the back down to the computer. We plugged into the media dock. Then we're going to plug into the Thunderbolt card. Now we'll go to the computer so you can see what's going on. Down here in the bottom right corner under System Tray. Now the other icon hadn't popped up yet because there's nothing in the media reader. But I'll right click on this and we'll view attached devices. And this shows we have the Atech BlackJet Cinema dock on port number 1. What I especially like about this is with a media card, and I'll show it first because this is the expectation we have. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take an SD card like we use in the cameras. And that's something you might want to think about, folks. If you're using SD cards, this is a Pelican case. It's a hard shell case. Don't put these SD cards in a soft shell case. But I'm going to pull this card out. We're going to stick this in the media dock, see what we see. And what's going to be interesting is how quickly this pops up on screen. I'll just slide that in. Now there's a light that comes on over here on the left side. That should pop right up. Well, it always has. Okay, under Manage Approved Devices, if you'll notice it says Attached. Okay, now that we have the media dock plugged in, I'm going to show you what you'll see in the BIOS. Under Peripherals, Mass Storage Devices. It's not seeing the card like it needs to, but it's seeing this drive. And these will come up as phantom devices when this works accordingly. Leave these on auto, don't change them, don't do anything. But the UX1, M10, M201, M211, and M221. It sees each one of these modules as a separate device when this works. But there's nothing here you need to change. I'm just showing you what's there. Now, if you reboot the computer while this thing's plugged in, it's going to slow things down for the boot process because it's trying to figure out what's there. How much does it slow it down? Well, instead of having an NVMe drive, you'll think you've got a spinning drive. It's going to take that long. Okay, that came up pretty quick this time. First thing I'm going to do is go to Device Manager and see if we're back up. Now I'll go to the System tray. Yes, it's going to work now. Okay, what I'm trying to show you is how this works. It's kind of hit or miss. Everything is not all there yet. What I had to do is reboot the computer. So what I'm showing you, the two places you have to check and the things you can expect to see in the computer. I have to go to Device Manager and tell it to enumerate or to re-enumerate the device. And what you're going to see is what I'm going to show you. Everything looks good in Device Manager, so I'm looking down here on the System tray. And on the System tray, it shows an ATA controller and eject M1. You don't want to mess with any of those. But if this shows up, let me do it again. I'll click on the System tray, and there's the USB icon to remove stuff. And it shows these devices. If that shows correctly, now it shows removable disk. That will work. So it's enumerating. So the next step, we're going to try this again. We're going to take this memory card. We're going to plug it in and see what happens. You'll see it over my shoulder. Should pop up. Now I'll go ahead and flip to that screen so you can watch as this goes. Okay, when I stick this memory in, the drive should pop up. Yep, a light came up on the module and there it is. Now there's also a light right here showing that this module is active, a red light here. So there's a white light on the left showing power to the device once we've plugged in, that we have connectivity, and then there's activity on this module with a red light. All three of these slots are seen as one. And if you notice, it popped right up. That's the expectation we have to make this thing work. Now with this up, I can see what's on the disk. This is what came out of a camera. And there's the video files. I can play them. And if I pull the memory out, that closes right back up. And if I put it back in, it'll pop right up again. Now I'm going to go down here to the System tray and zoom in on that and show you what we're going to see. Under USB, it shows a USB drive D, and there it shows M2 eject Canon E. Well, that's interesting. That has not shown before. It just showed the bottom one. So the interaction that's going on, we need that BIOS update, but until we get it, everything else is current. But the chipset was what made this work last time. And rebooting is what's making it work this time. But if you can't enumerate the device, and I'm going to show you because the next step, that's the simple part. It's trying to read one of these SSDs that's a little more complicated. But my goal is to be able to read an SSD because our SSD recorder that we record this meeting with has a Thunderbolt 2 connection, but that Thunderbolt 2 connection I can't get into this card because this card will see the device, but it won't see the slots or it won't see the SSDs that's in there. Whereas this, I can see it, and what I'm trying to do, here's what I go through now. Whenever we have the SSD we pull out of the recorder, that's why every machine has removable racks. I have to take the SSD, put it in this IC dock, and then I take this IC dock and it takes the connectors that are in an odd place on the back and puts them over to the side like a regular 3.5-inch drive. I can then stick that into a removable drive and make this 2.5-inch device act like a 3.5-inch device. I want to eliminate that process. That's the purpose of the media dock, so this thing goes a whole lot quicker. Once we get everything working like it needs to, remember there's leading, bleeding, cutting, and trailing edge, and I always say let somebody else bleed. Well, right now this is bleeding edge stuff that is not supposed to work. There's a guy that's got a video up on YouTube about doing a hack on the BIOS, and what he did, he knew what to extrapolate on the Intel BIOS to put the hooks in for this to work. We don't have that. We're waiting for the BIOS, the official BIOS. So now I'm going to take this SSD and put it in. I'll show you. This is a little bit trickier. But if you want to try this, it works. It's just not all there. So I've installed an SD card. Now we're going to install this SSD. We'll see what happens. Okay, now I've installed the SSD, and I expect we may see another error. If not, then what I need to do, because it won't pop up on its own, I'll look down here under the icon to remove and eject media. Okay, the device has not been enumerated yet. And you notice I'm not looking at the Thunderbolt software, I'm looking at the USB software. So I'm going to go back to Device Manager, and I'm going to say, there we go, scan for hardware. Now once it scans, there, bingo, it popped right up. So far, every time I plug in an SSD, I have to go through this. I have to go and tell it to scan for hardware changes. Once it enumerates, then it pops right up. We need that hook for that interconnectivity so those two can talk to each other. Right now the BIOS is not talking to the firmware. Firmware can't talk to the BIOS because the BIOS doesn't know what's going on, and that's the reason we see these phantom drives. But we got it working. It's bleeding edge technology. But if you want to know what to do and how to make it work, that's just why I'm sharing it with you. So now there's the media. I can copy it off, I can play it, I can change the file names, whatever I need to do. Even though I have to jump through some hoops to make this work, I'm not having to use the AIC dock to put it in one device, to put it in another device to get it in the computer. And what I really like is the ability to read the SD cards. Otherwise, I'm using a memory reader that I plug into the USB 3 port, and that's annoying because when I take the memory out to swap it, I've got to unplug the device, plug it back in, then plug new memory in it. That's just a hassle. When this works, and it's going to work, it's going to be amazing. But with these two pieces of equipment, this is as far as we've gotten. And the third device, like I said, I won't plug it in, but you can see it. I'll show you again. Down here on the system tray, right-click, View Attached Devices. Approved Attached Devices on port 1 are Manage. So we'll go to Manage. And what we see is the devices, or the computers if we had a network connection, which we don't, but the devices. And we could remove selected devices or remove all devices. Then that screen pops up asking us what we want to do with it. We're going to leave it like it is. Now I want to show you some other technology that I think you're going to want to see. Thunderbolt, about. It's important to know your NVM firmware version, and it's important to know your security level authorization. By default, it's SL1. Once we get BIOS support, I expect this to change, where you can select this. Okay, I want to show you some information that you're going to want to read. First, I'd suggest read the information that comes in the driver download. Second, you'll want to read this Intel information. Third, I would suggest look at Gigabyte's site. And number 4, take a look at the information from the Thunderbolt site. And we'll put links up to all the information, but I want to show you this right quick. Okay, this is a document from Intel, Thunderbolt 3 and security on Microsoft Windows 10 operating system. This is dated September 2018. This talks about Thunderbolt 3. It's important to know because when you're talking about security and you're talking about some of these other pieces of information that are relevant, authenticating devices, the cryptographic authentication, separating Thunderbolt data stream, which is important. That Thunderbolt data stream is separate from the display data. The unique ID number, and this is really interesting. Every Thunderbolt 3 controller has a unique ID fused in silicone during production that allows to identify a specific device. So I wonder, can you install 2 of these cards in a machine? I don't know. The ACL, the accepted components list, that's important to know. The security level, the SL. And by default, looking at this card, we are on SL1 for user authorization. And SL1 is the default mode. Until we get that BIOS update, the way things are, it works. It's kind of a shaky deal. When you have a problem, you go into Device Manager and you tell it to scan for hardware changes. That lets it go and try to enumerate the device, and when it enumerates the device, then it'll come back. Now, if you come up with any kind of errors like that code 31 about the driver, reboot. That should bring it back. This is the information that I think is the most complete. This is from Atech, and this is about the media dock, the cinema dock. And this is the BlackJet UX1. And it shows here 4 things you need. The 5th thing that they don't mention, number 1, BIOS, yes. We've talked about that repeatedly. Number 2, the Thunderbolt 3 firmware, and number 3, the Thunderbolt 3 driver. Those appear to be somewhat related. I can show you information that appears that when you update the driver, it updates the firmware, but I can also show you information that shows the two that are separate, so I don't know. Windows 10 needs to be current, and the last thing that they don't mention is the chipset driver. Your chipset has got to be current. Now, if you go to Thunderbolt Technology and look at this thunderbolttechnology.net/updates, you're going to go in a circle. You're not necessarily going to find the information you want. Another important piece of information that's good to know about this device, we'll take a look at their Thunderbolt products. We're looking specifically at the BlackJet UX1, Thunderbolt 3 Cinema Dock, SSD, CFast, QXD, CF, SD, and microSD. Actually, SDXC. But the modules, these 2 modules on the right, are interchangeable. You can see what the back looks like. It's got a power tap, 2 Thunderbolt connections. And yes, it's compatible with the Thunderbolt 2 adapter. We've done that, but we don't get connectivity. I think it's because we need the BIOS update. And until we get that BIOS update, we've only got this much working. A user guide support, the FAQ I showed you, and some features. Now, right here, extra modules available. You can get an extra module to duplicate anything you have, and the next module coming out is the Red Mini-Mag coming out in March of 2019. So if you got a Red Mini-Mag camera, that's the way to go. I know a lot of people are going to be interested in this. It's very curious technology. Once we get this update, we'll update this video, put another video out and show you what it took to make everything finally mesh together. But we have the card installed, we have the driver installed. Our BIOS has had 3 updates. We've got the most current BIOS available. The card has current firmware, current driver. There's only 1 driver showing up on Gigabyte's site. Everything with this card matters. So we've got the card installed, we've got the device connected to it, and I've shown you how when you have a problem to go to the system tray icon or to the device manager to get this thing to re-enumerate and to bring it up. And if you get any kind of errors that are in your device manager about an error code 31, do not go looking for a driver. What you need to do is install your chipset driver, and if you still get that error, reboot and see if it'll go away. Until we get this thing more solidly integrated, these are the hoops we have to jump through to make it work. So I hope you enjoyed this. Hope you found it informational. I appreciate it if you'd subscribe. Thanks for watching. And in the next video, we're going to start doing some more stuff with the NVMe drives. We need to upgrade our NVMe drive, and we're also going to do some stuff with NVMe RAID, which is a whole other animal. But on this machine, we've got the resources for it. So I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.